What an incredible last 3 days here at the Sing Conference in Nashville, Tennessee. We've been so encouraged, as you see this set here, to have interviews with key speakers and hear really just wonderful testimonies. Things that I know will encourage you in learning how to share your faith with a crazy culture, how to just grow deeper in your walk with Jesus, and then to hear what God is doing around the world. Now, I pray you'll stay tuned and that you'll watch this next video, and I know that it'll be an encouragement to you.
Ross Wilson, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. And you're one of Ireland's leading artists and sculptors. And as we know, as Ireland goes, so goes the world. So really, you're one of the world's best artists and sculptors. I know you wouldn't say that, but truly a gift. And you've been a guest speaker at Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge. You've had some of your works in the National Portrait Gallery in London. You're well known for your C.S. Lewis sculpture that's in East Belfast, and that's just a little bit of your resume, which it doesn't even scratch the surface. But I'd love to know more about you and your family.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for your introduction. I didn't recognize myself there. As a child growing up, I was excited about seeing things. And I think that's a spiritual thing, sight, because sight is informed by light. And light helps us see things on so many levels, inwardly, outwardly, emotionally, in all kinds of ways, and sometimes in ways we never expect. So growing up, I was excited just about seeing things. I couldn't believe it. Every day I could see and experience new things. And my parents encouraged me in that. You know, they couldn't go to college, they had to go and work. But they encouraged me to see, and I'm so thankful for that. And I'm still excited about seeing things. I'm so thankful I can wake up in the morning and look out and see where I live. I live in the country, and you know, we're surrounded by trees, and in the spring and different times of the year, bird song, like almost songs from another world that celebrate God's creation. So that's something I think that we need to encourage our children to interact with. And our education systems in the UK and in America, I'm sure, seem to educate children out of creativity. And that's wrong, that's not good.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, so married?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm married. My wife is called Liz, and I have a daughter called Grace, who's 23 years old.
Yeah.
Who just graduated from Durham University. She studied music and theology.
Okay. Yeah. You still get to see her quite a bit?
She's now working in London.
Okay.
And has a really amazing job. So I don't see her that very often. I did see her about a month ago, where she came to surprise me at a portrait unveiling in Bath, at Bath University. And I didn't realize she was coming, so it was really beautiful to see her. And yeah, I mean, she means so much to me.
Yeah.
So very much. And again, it's about the idea of cherishing our children and trying to encourage and inform them and direct them. They don't always take that direction, but I think sometimes when they're older, they'll look back and realize it was the right direction.
Yeah. Would you say she takes some of the creative side of you?
Oh yeah, she's very creative. I mean, I believe all children are. I think it's part of our DNA that God has given to us. But unfortunately, some parents don't value it, and they don't encourage their children in it. And as I say, the education system doesn't always, unless you find an inspirational teacher. When I was 14, I met my art teacher, who changed my life, and changed it in a 7-minute conversation.
Wow.
So what we say, how we act, what we do around our children helps inform them for their future identity. So yeah, my daughter plays violin, piano, and is a choral singer. Yeah, so she's quite creative and a little dramatic.
Who did she get that from?
Her mom.
Okay. Well, let me, I want to talk to you a little bit about this sculpture that you did, The Searcher, based on the C.S. Lewis letter. I want to hear the story about this, how it came about, just the whole process of that, if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
Well, looking back on that story, which happened 26 years ago now, it's a pretty profound story in the rear view mirror of hindsight. And at the time, it was quite, profound, but the more time has come between doing it and or what made me start to want to do it, and now has let me see how important it was. So it was inspired by a letter that C.S. Lewis wrote from Cambridge University when he was there in the last years of his life. He wrote 2 years before he died in 1961, on the 5th of March, to a 10-year-old girl called Anne Waller, who lived on a farm in Suffolk. And Anne's mother had bought her one of Lewis's children's books. And she was concerned as she was reading it about the great lion Aslan, and why this great lion would give himself up for the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve. And in her 10-year-old mind, she couldn't figure this out. Why such a brave, beautiful beast would lay his life down?
Makes sense.
Yeah. So she asked her mum, and her mum didn't know. She said, why don't you write to the person who wrote the book? And so she wrote to C.S. Lewis, like hundreds of other children. And he replied. And he replied in basically a one-paragraph letter, which explained the whole Chronicles of Narnia. And when I read the letter in 1997, it was one of those moments where you just felt something happening. I realize now it was this idea or concept that I've tried to, nourish, of grace exchange. And in that letter was grace. Lewis put grace into that letter because he knew what grace was, and he was living in grace. And so he passed that grace on to that child, to that 10-year-old girl. And it's a form of grace exchange. And it's a responsibility that all believers and Christians have to share the grace that they've been given with others. That can be in a high-profile way. It can be in a word of kindness. It can be in an embrace. It can be in a wave. It can be in getting alongside someone who's suffering loss. We have a responsibility to push it out. And Lewis did that in the letter. And so when I read the letter, it really inspired me. And I've read lots of things, but that stood out. And I thought I need to do something about this. At that time, Keith and I met up a few years earlier, and he was working on a musical called Jack. And it was coming up to the centenary of Lewis's birth. And we wanted to do something in the city of his birth, Belfast, to celebrate his amazing contribution to literature, to theology, and to imagination. And nothing was happening. So Keith Getty, he's now a really well-known hymn writer. Keith worked on a musical called Jack. And I thought I need to take this letter and use it for something. And I'd done one sculpture, my first sculpture the year before. And so I was in a place where I knew about, kind of knew about it, and I thought it would be great to do a sculpture based around this letter. So that's how the sculpture started, and the letter was the seed. And the seed was grace, because it was the grace that Lewis pushed out into that child's life. So I was able to trace her in 1997. And she was now married and had 2 grown-up children and was a teacher. And I remember the day I phoned her up and said, "Did you write to C.S. Lewis when you were 10? And she said, "How do you know that?" I said, "I saw the letter." She said, "Well, that letter hasn't been published. How did you see it?" It was a photocopy of the letter you let someone else see. It got passed on. And I said, "Can I use that letter as a starting point for a sculpture?" She said, "That's the best news I've heard all year." "Yes, you can." I said, "What was it like when you received the letter?" "Well, it was a Saturday morning. I was on the farm. My mum came and knocked my bedroom door and came in with the letter. And on the envelope, it had a stamp with a frank mark that said Cambridge. And my mum said to me, 'Who do you know in Cambridge?' And she said, I opened that letter and read it. And I carried that letter in my pocket for 2 years. Mr. Lewis helped me find my faith. So that even had more of an impact on me. And that was the inspiration behind the sculpture, the searcher. She was searching as a child, and Lewis responded to that search through the grace that he'd been given. And so on the back of the sculpture, which is a sculpture basically of Diggory Kirk, who was Lewis's alter ego, opening a wardrobe, on the back of the wardrobe is the letter in bronze. And so Lewis is still using that grace, and that grace is still being exchanged every day, because hundreds of people go to see that sculpture a week, sometimes more. and they're seeing and reading Lewis's words. That he sat down at a desk in Cambridge and wrote to a 10-year-old girl. So that grace is still being pushed out, and it still has the power, because the power hasn't diminished, because the grace hasn't diminished.
It's amazing, amazing. So did you know when you saw the letter, did you say to yourself, I want to do a sculpture, or did part of you say, I'd like to do a painting with this? Did you know right away what you wanted to do?
That's a good question. Well, normally it would have been a painting, but I thought, and it was a bizarre thought in one way, because to do a sculpture, and this is like 25 years ago, was real, and it's even more expensive now. And it was about £80,000, and I had no money. And so that would have been a hurdle for the idea, but yet the letter was so powerful that it took me across that first hurdle. And the person I met on the other side of that first hurdle was my niece, who was, I think, 5 years old. And she said, Uncle Ross, I'll make the first subscription to the sculpture. And she gave me £5.50 from her piggy bank. And looking back on that now, it's almost like another child has been involved in the process of that becoming something real. And I think Lewis would have liked that idea.
Yeah.
And she's now in her early 30s and a social worker. And her empathy that she had as a child has now worked out in her profession, where she helps other people, mainly children who are living in difficult conditions and in abusive families. So that's pretty profound.
Wow, that'd have been the real encouragement to you for
It
your
was.
niece to do that.
It was, and then I went to see the Belfast City Council arts officer. He thought this was a great idea, and he said, look, how much is this going to cost? I said, well, it's going to cost around £80,000. How much money have you got in place? I said, I've got £5.50. Okay, it's a great idea. We can offer you 80% funding from the lottery funding. And I said, I know you're going to think this is really weird, but I couldn't accept that. He said, are you serious? I said, yeah. He said, how much money have you got in place? I said, £5.50. Right, and you're refusing an 80% grant of £80,000? I said, yeah. I said, C.S. Lewis would not be happy with the idea of something that's being put in place to memorize his writing and his imagination that's coming from like a lottery, you know. So I'm going to have to refuse it. He said, well, you can leave my office now. I said, is there no other funding I can apply for? Well, there is, but you need to have more than £5.50 in place. So I walked out of the city council office thinking this is never going to happen. And then within 10 days, I got a phone call from a friend saying, look, there's a Christian guy who's a businessman from East Belfast, where Lewis was born and where the sculpture was going, who wants to donate £6,000. And I said, well, who is it? Well, he wants to do it anonymously. So then I thought, that's amazing, £6,000. So I went straight back to the city council office and said, look, I've got £6,005.50 now. £6,000 and £5. Where did you get £6,000 in 10 days? I said, it's a donation. Okay, what kind of donation? I said, well, it was donated anonymously. He said, why would someone want to donate £6,000 anonymously? I said, because they don't want to be known. That's why people do that sort of thing. He said, right, well, when I see official proof of this in a bank account titled C.S. Lewis Sculpture Fund, and you have two trustees, a Belfast City Councillor and an independent business person, and you come with that bank statement and show me that £6,005.50, you can apply for this other grant. So in another 2 weeks, I came back with he couldn't believe it. And then we got, I think we got something like maybe £8,000 from them.
Wow.
Yeah. And the rest of it was by me going and knocking on businesses' doors, and there was a tea company in East Belfast called Punjana Tea.
Yeah.
And they gave £2,000, and I've been drinking Punjana for the last 25 years. And I like to mention them in situations like this to promote.
Absolutely.
I like to think I've repaid them several times by now.
That's right. That's right. So how long did that whole process take, do you think, from the time you had the idea, God put that on your heart, to when it actually was installed?
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing that happened really fast. And to make a sculpture on that scale, like a life-size figure with a wardrobe and all the technical aspects of a foundation, and having the site like redone and landscaped and benches and mature trees put in, it all happened within a year, which is, looking back, you think, well, I've worked on projects that are a fifth of that scale, and the complications sometimes around them takes longer. So it was like a really smooth path. And I remember, I didn't have enough money to do a chair. There's a chair in the sculpture. So it's Diggory Kirk opening the wardrobe with one hand and holding a chair with another. And the chair is really a device for children to sit on. And so when they sit in the chair, they're transported through the imagination of Lewis, through Diggory Kirk and into Narnia. But I didn't have enough money to do a chair. Originally, the sculpture was holding a book. It was cheaper to do a book in bronze. But then someone sponsored the chair, like an individual, and that was great.
Yeah.
It was amazing. And that gave the whole dynamic, because it's like a compositional thing where the chair is lower, then there's the figure, and then there's the wardrobe. So you're going up, you're like going further up and further in, as Lewis would talk about.
I love that. Oh, that's fantastic. That is great. I know this holds significance to you. What significance does this piece hold in your heart, do you feel like, when you think back about it, and maybe even kids that have sat in that chair?
That's a good question. It's become more significant as I get older. And I'm not really someone who's like into building a legacy or thinking, what is my legacy going to be? But it probably would be, I would say, my legacy in one sense. It's definitely Lewis's legacy because of the letter. And it has impacted a lot of people. I didn't realize at the time when it's been on field, like, I think 300 people turned up, which I didn't realize the response that would have on a lot of people's hearts because of the impact Lewis had on their lives. And lots of really interesting things have happened in front of that sculpture. I haven't been there for a while, but I remember years ago I had a friend who immigrated to New Zealand as a pastor, and eventually got married and came back about 15 years later. And like my work career after college had started to evolve and improve, and the sculpture had happened in that time. And he wanted to bring his wife, because she was a big C.S. Lewis fan, she was from New Zealand, to see the sculpture, and he wanted me to meet them at the sculpture. And I was reluctant, because every time I go to that sculpture with someone I know walks past or sees me, and it looks like I'm always hanging out there. And it might be once or twice a year.
Yeah.
So I went with this guy, my friend Colin, and his wife, and she was like enamored by the whole thing. But just as I was there, around the corner from the library, because it's in front of a library, came a mum with two kids, a boy and a girl, and the girl was about 8 or 9 years old, and she was running around the sculpture. And in the ground around the sculpture there's text in granite, and it says, part of it says C.S. Lewis, born 1898, or sorry, date of birth 1898, date of rebirth 1931. And the little kid shouts out to her mum, and my friend and his wife were standing just a little bit away. She shouts out, "Mum, what does rebirth mean?" And my friend, the pastor, says, "You need to go and speak to that child." I said, "Walk over and speak to the child." "No, you need to go and speak to that child." And I thought, right, okay. So I went over to the mum and said, "Look, I know you're going to think this is really weird." And she saw me, and she's probably, but I did the sculpture. Before I could say anything, she says, "This man will explain what rebirth means." So this little kid runs over to me and is looking up, and I'm looking down thinking I've got like one shot to explain the whole concept of rebirth.
Yeah.
And I tried to do it as best I could, and in a very simple way. And I said, does that explain it?" And she went, "Yeah," and then started running around again. But looking back in that, if that sculpture, if all of that was just for that one moment where that all lined up in my spiritual landscape, it was worth it.
Yeah. Well, and I love you attached the letter to the back of the wardrobe, and how many people have seen that, have read that, and as you mentioned, Lewis is using that letter today, right? Like, he's explaining the gospel through his stories.
And that's the grace exchange. That's the power of this grace exchange.
Yeah.
And as Christians, we don't often grasp that concept. I mean, Lewis did it through a letter, did it through his writings. In that case, he did it through a letter in the back of a sculpture.
Yeah.
He never knew it was going to end up there.
Right.
I think he'd be okay about it, because it was like,
I think so.
Yeah, because it's promoting, truth.
Yeah.
And it's promoting redemption, and it's promoting the idea of a lost world that can be saved. And that's what he says in the letter. The whole Narnian stories, and this is what he said, is about Christ.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's a big gospel tract.
It is.
Yeah.
And one that'll last for many, many years.
That's engaging.
Yeah.
And that's another thing we have to be mindful of as Christians, that we engage with an increasingly secular world that's becoming darker. And how do we engage? We engage by enchantment, especially as anybody who's involved in the arts.
Yeah.
Whether it's music, dance, like poetry, plays, all that kind of area where people want to connect with and need to connect with, because for a lot of people that's their, their spiritual identity. So if you can do this as a believer in a way that is really coherent and not cringeworthy, and in a way that connects or stops someone and makes them think, that's so important.
Yeah, as Pascal would say, make them wish it were true.
Yes.
We have to get them to
Yes.
that point where it's a beautiful story they wish were true.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's the whole idea of enchantment, and we've neglected that
We have.
in our subculture,
Yeah.
and with no disrespect, often in our churches.
Yeah.
And we neglect creativity in our churches because we practice one form of creativity only, and that's music. And that's important, but it's not the only form of creativity that we could be using to enhance the service.
Yeah.
And obviously done at the right and high level.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Well, continuing with the theme of C.S. Lewis, you mentioned to me that you once got a phone call inviting you to an event where there would be an important person there. I think you didn't actually believe that was the case, but I'd love for you to talk as much as you'd like to about that situation and what came out of it.
Okay, well, it was an unusual phone call, which I thought was a prank call, inviting me to dinner with the Prince of Wales in a castle in Ireland, in the north of Ireland. And I initially thought it was a practical joke because I've got a friend who's a hymn writer, and we would used to do extravagant practical jokes where we could impersonate famous evangelists or in phone calls. So I thought that this had been a setup, and I was going to go along, say yes, and go along to the castle and be nobody there. So I said, look, I'm sorry, I can't make it. I'm busy that night. And then my wife said, you need to be careful that could be genuine. And so I was able to get the number through dialing 1571. It was the recall of the last number, and phoned back, and it was genuine. And I said, look, I can't. I've checked my diary. I can't make it. So I ended up going along to that, and the people who were organising it wanted to give the Prince a gift, and asked me did I have any ideas, because he's a very gifted painter as well, and is into the whole creative thing in a big way, on many different levels. And I said, look, I've got a sketch of the person who taught the Prince to paint. This was a man called Derek Hill, who'd encouraged me when I was a student. He bought some of my work from an exhibition, and that was a big thrill that Derek Hill had bought a little landscape I painted. So I'd done some portrait studies of him, and I said to the organizer, look, I've got a portrait study of the guy who taught me to paint. It would be quite a unique gift to give to him, and you can have it and give it to him. And the guy said, well, if we're going to give him that, you present it to him. I said, I'm not presenting it to him. You're the artist. So I thought, wow, here's an amazing opportunity to put something into his hands, not just a portrait, but what can I put with the portrait that would be spiritual? And another friend of mine, Derek Bingham, had written an amazing booklet called Walking with Giants about the conversion of C.S. Lewis and the conversation on Addison's Walk with Tolkien and some other friends. And I thought, and it's a really beautifully produced booklet, really high quality. And it's the sort of thing, even if you handed it to an atheist, they'd be intrigued enough to read it. Yeah. It's beautifully designed and laid out, and it's been used, in so many different situations. So I thought, I will put this on the back of my portrait with a note, and this is a one-shot deal. At least it's something I believe that's of spiritual value that may get into the Prince's life. Or connect with him. He may even read it. So I put it on the back of the portrait in an envelope and presented the portrait, thinking, he's either going to think I'm crazy, or he may have a sense of wonder about it. I didn't realize that he'd read it that night, and he wrote me a 4-page letter, which was hand-delivered about 2-3 days later, saying that he'd read the booklet and found it utterly riveting and would now go out and buy all the books by C.S. Lewis that he hadn't read and re-educate himself.
Wow.
And I thought that was such a graceful thing to say and admit.
Yeah.
And so that sort of blew me away. And again, that was the great exchange of somebody writing about Lewis in a really amazing way.
Yeah.
That had a quality to it that didn't bring any resistance.
Yeah, it amazes me that you've thought, I guess a lot of people I would think, you get an invitation from somebody like that, you don't necessarily think about the gospel right off the bat. And you were thoughtful enough to think this is could be my one chance to present God's story of love and grace to somebody that may need it.
Yeah. And maybe in some Christian circles that might be a little eccentric. But, what was going to happen? What was the worst could happen?
Yeah.
He didn't read it.
Yeah.
And why not take the opportunity to put it there?
Yeah.
And he received it really well. And that led on to a really close relationship.
Yeah.
And lots of things have happened since then that opened the door,
Yeah.
So the worst thing that can happen to someone in situations like that, or if you're thinking about, should I do this, should I not, as a believer, is a little word with just 2 letters, and it's called no.
Yeah.
That's the worst that someone could say, no, or I don't want it, or whatever. But that fear of the no keeps so many people back.
Yes.
And that was something I learned way back, actually on my first trip to America, when I went to Harvard University to do a lecture, which is another story. But I realized the fear of no can keep you back from going somewhere you should be, or from doing something you should do. And we need to be careful that the fear of man creates a snare.
Well, you've had a lot of connection with C.S. Lewis throughout your life. It seems like it's an amazing influence, along with the grace of the gospel. Do you have any upcoming projects, or have you just finished any projects that you'd like to mention that have been, fun, unique to you?
Yeah, well, I've finished 3 projects recently, 2 sculpture projects, which involved something I'd never been involved in before, which was engineering. I'm not an engineer, but I know a good engineer.
Yeah.
And got help and worked with different people, which for me was a big thing, because being an artist is often a solitary pursuit. So to get other people involved, and one of the sculptures involved like a massive foundation, a giant crane hire, which I'd never been involved in before. I thought naively you could hire a crane for 2 hours, but no, it's a day hire.
Yeah.
Because it's like a massive telescopic crane, and it takes it about, wherever it's coming from, about 2 hours to get to the site. And the rate per hour, I wasn't aware of what that was, and I had a set budget. So all these things, the costs had ranked up, and it was a granite plinth, which was 11 foot long by 2.5 foot wide, and it weighed 4 ton. And when I went to see the stonemasons in the mountains, in the mountains of Mourne, which Lewis loved, as well,
Yeah.
where they're based, I was told that the price of granite had tripled since the pandemic. And I said, well, how did that work out? Because it was there before the pandemic. I mean, for quite a few years.
Yeah.
How all of a sudden has the price of granite tripled in price since the pandemic? And he said, well, it's not actually the granite, it's labor costs. So that was another dent in the budget.
Sure.
But it all came together. So trying to work with all those different groups and working with an engineering company, and another guy who technically advised me, was the first time I'd really been experiencing having like a big team of different experts.
Yeah.
And they were all really focused and helped a lot. So the other thing is, it's really important to get the right help when you're doing something. The right advice. And that applies to life as well. Oftentimes we think we can do it and we know how to do it, and then it just turns out to be a mess. But if you can have someone who can guide you and help you, that helps that process or the project becomes success. So those projects I didn't know about this time last year when I was in Nashville.
Really?
And they came, and one was a really amazing portrait commission of the Chancellor of Bath University. He was an amazing guy, like an amazing Christian. He was the master of Jesus College, Cambridge, who developed fiber optic broadband, and is like, you know, just, and I, like, he's an amazing guy. I didn't realize until that we went to the same primary school. And then I sort of vaguely remembered him, you know, like all those years later.
Yeah.
Like over 40 years later. But that was a really nice experience.
Yeah.
To be commissioned to make his portrait. Yeah. And those things have to be really, I mean, the key thing about making a portrait, if you're commissioned to make a portrait, is that it looks like the person. Because if it doesn't look like them, you're not getting paid.
That's step one.
Yeah,
That's step one.
That's the major
That's right.
one thing you must keep in mind.
Okay.
And then the other thing is the fear, does the sitter like the portrait? That's always like a frightening experience when you have to send evidence of your portrait to the sitter, because they obviously want to see it before it's unveiled. But he graciously was very complimentary about it. And it's a difficult thing for some people to see their portrait. He's not the sort of guy who'd be someone who'd be sitting all day in front of his portrait admiring himself.
Yeah.
He'd find it a little embarrassing, but he was very open and gracious about it.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and a real example to me of someone who, in that process, encouraged me.
It's amazing how it just goes full circle sometimes. So, well, if somebody wants to take a look at your work without traveling to Ireland, what is your website, Ross?
I have a website which a friend of mine insisted that I update. I hadn't updated for 17 years. I just don't always get the time to do that. And it's reasonably up to date. And it's, I think the address of my website is artist@rosswilsonartist.com. I think that's it. Or if you just do a search for Ross Wilson Artist, it'll link into the website.
Yeah, wonderful. Because you have so much more work than we've even scratched the surface on. That's just truly amazing over the years. I'd love for
that's
people
just to do with
it.
That's a time thing.
That's right.
'Cause I've been around a lot longer than you.
I wouldn't say that.
You know, well, I'm never always very happy with what I do, and it's a bit like being in a giant hamster's wheel of, you know, trying to get there.
Yeah.
And Seamus Heaney, the very famous Irish poet and Nobel laureate, said that the artist is forever in the position of the person humming the hymn of its finished to the tune of its just begun.
Wow, I love that. Thank you so much for your time, Ross. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your encouragement.